Zhang on the Terrace of Gathered Spirits, number 1. Sunlight slants across the terrace of gathered spirits. Red flowers open to welcome the morning dew. Last night, the emperor issued a new order. Zhang smiled to herself as she came through his curtains. So, after a little hiatus motivated by a high workload during the last week or rather 2 weeks, I continue with the commentary and with the reading of the 300 Tang poems. This is the second of Zhang Hu's 4 poems included in the section of heptasyllabic quatrains, and it forms a couple with next day's poem, which is also on the Terrace of Gathered Spirits, number 2. Now, both of these poems are historical poems. They reference courtly scenes, and more specifically love affairs, of the High Tang period of Emperor Xuanzong and his favorite concubine, Zhang Guifei. And there's also a reference in the second poem, as we will mention the following day, to Zhang Guifei's sister, the consort of State Guo. Now, before delving a little bit into this poem, we have to explain a topic that frequently appears in Chinese literature, including in this poem, the rather misogynistic conceit of the kingdom-toppling beauty. Now, this topic already appears in the Book of Odes from the Eastern Zhou period, probably, at least in the sections that make a reference to a kingdom-toppling beauty. And then it appears in the historical chronicles of the Eastern Zhou and in the Han Dynasty. Now, the idea basically is putting the blame on the fall of dynasties on women. So the idea is that when some emperors become too pleasure-seeking, they are, seduced and waste their time with beautiful ladies. And sometimes these beautiful ladies, sometimes they're not even considered human, they're like demons in disguise. They are so obnoxious and so besotting and so distract the ruler and lead him on the wrong path that the dynasty falls. And the historical Chinese chronicles mention some of these women. So the last emperors of the mythical Xia, of the Shang, and of the Western Zhou dynasties would have been brought down because of these kingdom-toppling beauties. And later on, the ruler of the state, this is during the Warring States period, the ruler of the state of Wu was also brought down by a beautiful lady from Yue. We've encountered that story in this anthology already, and I think it was a poem, one or two, but one by Wang Wei, about this beautiful lady, Shi, who is an example of this kingdom-toppling beauty. So this myth, this legend would continue later on. So during the Tang Dynasty, as you well know, the Tang Dynasty almost collapsed at the end of Xuanzong's prosperous reign, and traditional myths, legends, and historiography put the blame on the fact that Emperor Xuanzong in his old age, after 40 years on the throne or so, got besotted with this beautiful lady, Zhang Guifei, and spent the time together with her, basically in the Huaqing Palace, a palace in the outskirts of the imperial capital, which is referenced here. And this also leads to a very tragic story, which we've already seen in this poem, in for example, in Bai Juji's Song of Everlasting Regret. After the rebellion broke out, the emperor had to flee the capital. His army mutinied and forced them to allow for the execution of Zhang Guifei. So this poem is referring to that period before the rebellion, in which the emperor is being besotted by this lady and spends time with her. So the topic of the poem, you could say it's historical, not too far in the past. Remember, Zhang Hu is a Tang Dynasty poet, so he is writing about events that had taken place less than half a century before his own time. There is, of course, in this poem an element of criticism of the decadence and the debauchery of emperors, the idea that the emperor must be a very moral person and that devoting too much time to pleasures can lead to national catastrophe. So there is a moralistic streak in this poem that fits well some of the conventional views about Zhang Hu. Okay, having given all that background information, let's go into the couplet itself, into the couplets, the 2 couplets that form the poem. One interesting thing that this poem does is in my opinion, is the first couplet evokes with images the message of the second couplet. So, first of the title, the Terrace of Gathered Spirits, that is a name, I think, for a building that was located in the Huaqing Palace. I haven't found conclusive information about this, but I think it's correct. So the Huaqing Palace was a palace located on some hot springs outside the imperial capital. It had many different pavilions, including the Pavilion of Long Life, which was where mostly, it seems, the emperor stayed with Zhang Weifei. And it also had religious structures. One of those religious structures would have been this Terrace of the Gathered Spirits, which would have been a Daoist complex. Now, the anecdote behind the poem relates to a very specific moment in the relationship between the emperor, Tan Xuanzong, and Yang Weifei. So the story goes that Yang Weifei was in the beginning the wife of one of Tang Xuanzong's sons. Now, when Tang Xuanzong's wife died, she, in a visit of condolences, he saw this daughter-in-law of his and, fell completely head over heels in love with her. But of course, an emperor can't just steal the wife of his son. So what he did was he persuaded her to become a Daoist nun and therefore break her marriage with his son. And she became a Daoist nun, and she went to the imperial palace, in fact, to this Terrace of Gathered Spirits. So that was a thinly veiled excuse for getting the woman close to the emperor and for getting the woman divorced from her son. And afterwards the emperor gave another concubine, another wife, to his son. And after a little time of having this lady as an apparent Daoist nun in the imperial palace, he released her from her religious vows and married her. So that's the anecdote being referenced here. Let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So first couplet: sunlight slants across the terrace of gathered spirits. Red flowers open to welcome the morning dew. So we get this, in this first couplet appears to be purely descriptive. It's just describing us a morning on the terrace of gathered spirits. It's the morning. The sunlight is slanting in, so the sun is still rising. It's still hidden behind the mountains, so its rays only reach the palace obliquely, slantingly. At the same time that these rays are arriving, the red flowers, so we might imagine that the terrace is decorated by different flowers and trees, so the red flowers open to welcome the morning dew. So in this wonderful morning, the flowers open, it's believed, and dew falls from heaven, and that's why the flowers are opening. So this seems to be an innocuous, a neutral enough description of a natural scene. So what appears to be a relatively innocuous description of morning, nevertheless should be interpreted in code with what comes next in the poem. Well, let's read what comes next, and then we go back to the first couplet. Second couplet. Last night the emperor issued a new order. Yang Weifei smiled to herself as she came through his curtains. So what has happened? The emperor has issued a new order. The new order has been presumably for Yang Weifei to become a nun, a Daoist nun, and to start serving in the imperial palace. Of course, Yang Weifei is not fooled. Even if the emperor had not told her directly, she knows that the emperor is calling her to become a nun because the emperor wants her to divorce his son and wants to have her close in the imperial palace and to eventually turn her into an imperial concubine. That's why the order has been emitted, and the concubine is smiling to herself, so probably smiling as she's crossing the curtains, perhaps the curtains of the Terrace of Gathered Spirits, or anyway, the curtains perhaps of the imperial presence itself. But this smile is meant to be coquettish and probably inappropriate, in the sense that, the woman is pretending to be a Daoist nun, and she's entering the sacred precincts with, this coquettishness of and slight hypocrisy of knowing that she's not actually a vocational nun and that she's not going to serve as such in the palace. With this idea, with this message in the second poem, this view of the beautiful concubine smiling to herself as she enters the religious precincts of the imperial palace, and with the idea that the emperor has decided to bestow not only this new order, but his favor on this new beloved lady, we can reread the first couplet as the objective elements in nature which are echoing or prefiguring this action. So sunlight slants across the terrace of gathered spirits. Now the sunlight slanting can be a very good symbol, or it can be construed as a very good symbol of the rising sun, which in this case is Zhang Guifei, who is becoming the rising sun in the emperor's life. She is becoming the woman who the emperor wants to be with. She is becoming the rising sun, the concubine, the wife in his horizon that will blot out all of the other stars and the moon. And the image in the second line, the red flowers opening to welcome the morning dew. Morning dew is a heavenly gift bestowed upon flowers, but it's very commonly used, I think, also as a metaphor for the imperial grace, for the imperial benevolence, for imperial gifts. And here, the imperial favor, like morning dew, is falling on a flower that is opening, which is very obviously also, or can very obviously be interpreted as Zhang Guifei herself. So here we have a very good exemplification of something we've talked about in a lot of previous poems, how the first couplet sometimes is more like naturalistic, descriptive, objective. The second one is more specific. Sometimes this makes it also more explicitly emotional. But here, the second couplet is actually giving us the historical anecdote, the story. The first couplet is evoking it through images of nature surrounding the imperial palace. So, okay, it's an interesting piece of craft, of word craft. And of course, there's this element of implicit, if not very explicit, criticism on the emperor's behavior and on Zhang Guifei's behavior. In fact, she is referred in the poem, that does not appear in the translation, but she is referred in the poem with her name as a nan, as Tian Chen or Tia Chen, something like that, which makes it doubly opprobrious. I think this hypocritical, beautiful woman who is besotting the emperor and leading him, as we know as readers and as Zhang, who expected his readers to know, in the wrong direction.